We're sitting with Caroline Sinnan, one of our agents here at Terra Caribbean.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
Welcome, Caroline.
Thank
and
you.
Today we're going to talk a bit about what you need in order to sell your property. So what is required to list, to sell your property, and to complete the transaction. Let's start with freehold property, Caroline.
Right. So the first thing a seller would need if they would like to sell their property, the first document they would need is a deed. Right?
Of course.
So it can either be a deed or a certificate of title. Now, this title document is what proves interest in the property. The interest can be freehold or leasehold. So we could probably
Correct.
talk a little bit about freehold, and then we could talk about leasehold after.
Yeah, let's start with freehold.
So freehold. So you have your deed. That's the first document. That proves ownership. Second document would be a WASA clearance certificate. Land and building taxes paid up to 2009, your WASA bill that's paid, the WASA receipt evidencing
Correct.
payment. Now we have on stream the property tax.
Yeah.
So the seller will have to pay property tax up until the closing date.
To reiterate that, as it relates to WASA,
Mm-hmm.
you need two things. You need a WASA clearance and you need to show that you've paid up to date. So there's two items.
That's correct.
And as it relates to property tax now, we have the assessment and property tax paid up to 2009,
Right?
right, which was when the tax was abolished, as well as the new tax, the new property tax, which is a PIN number,
Right.
right? So you apply, you get this PIN number,
That's it.
and then you can register and pay.
That's it.
From what I understand, where your property hasn't been assessed and you haven't actually been provided with a tax document
No.
showing your new tax amount, once you can prove to the government that you have applied,
That's right. You must file. So you have to prove that you've filed even though you haven't been assessed as yet. You must file first.
right, and once you file, you get that number, right?
PIN number. That's
Right.
it.
Very good. So if I may, let's take a step back to freehold property.
Sure.
So freehold property, in my understanding, is you are the outright owner of the land in its entirety, right? I mean, maybe you could elaborate on that?
Yeah, so that's absolutely correct. So a freehold land is the owner owns the right to the land. You can do anything you want to do. There are no covenants, there are no restrictions for you. You own it absolutely. Leasehold land is you own the land for a certain number of years. It can be from 99 years to 199 years. So with leasehold land, you are restricted in certain, you may have some covenants that you have to abide by. You may not be able to do certain things with the land. You may need to get consent to do that with leasehold property.
With freehold property, so I get questions from time to time. Property is freehold, so I could build what I want, right? That's not entirely true.
That's not entirely true. You must still comply with town and country. That's
Absolutely.
right.
Now, as it relates to leasehold, it says clearly what the use of the land must be.
That's right.
And so if it's agriculture, it speaks to one small building to facilitate the use of the land
Yes.
for agricultural purpose.
Yeah.
Whereas if it's single residential dwelling house, obviously you're restricted by that as well.
Yeah.
So as it relates to a leasehold property, Caroline, the seller or the lessee would bring the existing lease to Terra Caribbean and we would use that to assign the lease. But tell us about the process.
Okay, so you would have to pay your lease rent up to date. The lessor must give you consent if the lease provides for consent.
Correct.
If it's a condominium, the service charge must be paid up to date. If the vendor, for instance, is a company, the vendor must have signed, sealed bylaws and must provide a copy of a valuation.
That's a good point, actually. In order to register a new lease or deed with the government, you must provide a valuation
That's right.
for stamp duty purposes.
Yes.
Even if you're buying cash, right?
Yes.
So you would need a valuation to borrow money from the bank. But even if you're paying cash, you need a valuation to register your deed.
That's it. So if the seller is a company, the seller will have to provide signed, sealed bylaws as well as a copy of their annual returns.
So the annual return shows who the beneficial shareholders are in the company, who can sign on behalf of the company
Yeah.
to sell the asset that the company owns or to sell the shares or transfer the shares of the company.
That's right.
Right? And in the case of a holding company, the sole asset of that company may be a property that would be conveyed with the transfer of the shares.
Yep.
So Caroline, what should a seller bring to us at Terra Caribbean when they want to list their property for sale?
Right. So the first thing the seller should bring to us would be their deed or their certificate of title. What we usually ask for would be the KYC. We just ask for some simple KYC documents to be completed and 2 forms of ID. Once we have a buyer, we bring a buyer to the table. A sale agreement is then drawn up.
Yeah.
All right, we prepare the sale agreement, and then the buyer's attorney, they would do due diligence now to ensure that the person selling actually owns this property. So they would do title searches. On a deed, they go to the land registry, and they would look for the root of title, minimum 20 years back, to make sure there's no break in the chain. So once there's no break in that chain and it comes straight up to the seller, then
it's considered clear title.
Then it's considered clear title.
They also search for encumbrances.
They do, to just ensure that there are no encumbrances or mortgages. It's fine if the seller has a mortgage. Just once on completion, that mortgage is released. And for instance, on a certificate of title, the back of that certificate of title is endorsed with that chain as well.
Yes.
So that's much easier to see than, for instance, a deed.
Yeah, it's interesting that we have 2 completely different forms of freehold title in Trinidad and Tobago, right?
A dual system, and about 80 to 90% of land and property in Trinidad is still under the Old English common law.
Right. So Caroline, while we do produce purchase agreements here at Terra Caribbean, we always recommend having attorneys on both sides of the transaction. However, the buyer's attorney does most of the work, correct?
Yeah, so the buyer's attorney will have the majority of the work to do in order to close the transaction. The first thing would be the title searches. They pay the 10% down payment.
Yep.
And then closer to completion, they would pay the 90% balance remaining.
Yes.
Right? And then before we close, the buyer must get a valuation of the property. This valuation is for stamp duty purposes, which will be assessed by the Board of Inland Revenue.
Yeah, absolutely. So they may need a valuation to borrow from the bank.
That's right.
But even if they don't need to borrow from the bank, they would need it to register the deed.
Yes.
And the buyer's attorney, I believe, produces the new deed for review by the seller, correct?
That's it, yeah. So it will either be a deed, it will be a deed of conveyance if it's freehold property.
Correct.
And if it's leasehold property, it will be a memorandum of assignment.
As it relates to commercial office buildings, like this one across the road, my understanding is that the landlord produces the lease agreement for review by the tenant, correct?
That's right. So it's the tenant's responsibility to pay for the preparation of that lease agreement.
Right, correct. Right. And to review the details.
And specifically speaking, in the lease, there are different covenants in the lease, as well as certain things like CAM charges. You would want to ensure that the landlord is responsible for taking out the garbage and for having adequate parking, maintaining their insurance, certain things like that, a right to access.
Correct. And just to be clear about that, CAM is Common Area Maintenance. And how they work it out, it's basically you pay a proportionate amount of the running cost of the building based on the amount of square footage you occupy in the building.
Yeah.
So let's say a 4-story building, you pay a quarter. If you have one floor, you pay a quarter of the maintenance of the building, as well as the security and any cost attributable to running that facility.
Yes. And it's also important to note that if it's a long-term tenancy, that lease should be registered.
Correct. I believe the law in Trinidad and Tobago is anything 3 years and beyond should be registered.
Yes.
But now more than ever, I think it's important that when you're selling a property, that you have a lawyer representing you.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, if it's a very complex property, if it's a company that you're selling, we tend to recommend that the seller has a lawyer who can represent him. Sometimes in the transaction, the buyer's attorney would ask for a lot of additional documents that may not necessarily be stated in the agreement for sale. And if it's a layman seller, that seller may not know if they should comply or if they shouldn't. So I think it's best, really, that a seller really has an attorney to act on their behalf.
Yeah, quite right. I've had a few instances recently where, for instance, the seller had to get consent to assign from the state or from even a private lessor. And you need to draft an appropriate letter that really transfers or consents to the assignment. Additionally, when selling a company, even a holding company, where the sole asset is the property, the buyer's attorney will be rightfully asking for lots of indemnities, right?
Yeah.
So, and it gets really complicated. So certainly I agree with you that a lawyer on the seller side,
I think so,
can only benefit. So Caroline, residential rental agreements are a bit different to these commercial office buildings, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, so the tenant would pay 1 month's rent plus 1 month security deposit.
Correct. Yeah.
The landlord would prepare, it's his cost to prepare the rental agreement. A real estate agent can provide a rental agreement, but more than likely a landlord will produce his own. And the security deposit will be refunded back to the tenant, usually within 30 days after the termination of the lease.
So Caroline, would it be fair to say that the majority of the landlords in Trinidad and Tobago were inherited from Britain, from the Crown? Correct?
Yeah, so that's right. And the intention behind that, I think, was just to have particular usage in different areas. So some areas would be residential, some would be agricultural, things like that.
Yeah, and it's interesting because we have such a varying use right here in Port of Spain. In fact, where we sit now in St. Clair, these are 99 and 199-year leases. These were originally residential leases.
Right.
People changed the use and built these big commercial offices now.
Buildings, yeah.
But there's a significant cost ascribed to change in the use.
Right.
Then you have areas like Woodbrook, which are 25 to 30-year leases, which were obviously done as residential areas back in the day to create housing. While just east of us here, just east of Maraval Road is Newtown, which is freehold.
Right.
So you need to understand as a buyer, when you're purchasing property in Trinidad and Tobago, understand the use and understand if it's a lease, the term of the lease, and what the covenants are.
Yeah, that's right.
Hey, so Caroline, thanks again for joining us. I mean, this is really about providing information, to inform the market as to what we do every day in real estate.
Yeah, no problem. I was happy to join, and I hope our audience learned something from our little talk.
So thanks to everybody for watching, and do remember, should you have any questions or concerns that are property related, feel free to reach out to any of our agents at Terra Caribbean.